Good afternoon. I'm Franklin Kelly. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator here at the National Gallery, and I thank you for all coming on this lovely day. First, we'll start with the most obvious thing, and that is the word curator, and where that word comes from, what its origin is. It comes, like so many things, from the word in Latin, which stands for care. And the standard definition is, quote, one that has the care and superintendence of something, especially one working in a museum, zoo, or other place of exhibit. Now, I also like to think that the word care can embrace not just the meaning of you're responsible for the well-being of something, but that you also care for the something that you are in charge of well-being. Now, it's mainly in America, not exclusively, mainly in America that curators, as in art museum professionals, are called that. In England, they are often called keepers, which is confusing because in this company, sometimes keepers are the people you associate with zoos. And then in France, they're usually called conservateurs, which is also confusing because conservators in this country are people who work on works of art, who restore them, who fix them when they're damaged, clean them. So it's confusing, but curator is what it is. There are also people who like to say that what a curator does is, quote, curate. And that is, as it's become typical, creation of a verb out of a noun. It is not wrong. In my many years of teaching, I was chagrined over time to see that things I kept telling my students were wrong, like split infinitives and that those no longer are wrong. So curate is no longer wrong. I don't particularly use it. I find it interesting how many sort of walks of life do now. Fashion designers curate fashion shows and people curate staged houses and anyway. But I've always thought curate is another word, and that's curate, which is, simply speaking, a member of the clergy who's in charge of a parish. That's not what I do. My father was a theologian, but he wasn't in charge of a parish. Anyway, so curators at museums, now they can take many different types of identities, and often that depends on the size of the museum, and we're talking about art museums specifically. Small museums often may have one curator who is responsible for the breadth of the entire collections of that institution, which might range in chronology from the ancient to the contemporary. They might range in media from paintings, works on paper, to crafts, to who knows what. Medium-sized museums often have several curators, most generally broken down into areas by medium or by chronology. So they may have a curator of ancient art, a curator of Renaissance, or they may have a curator of paintings, curator of sculpture. And then in the very largest museums like the National Gallery, there are many curators. There are more than 30 here at the Gallery, ranging from assistant curators, associate curators, full curators, senior curators, and then there's one chief curator, that's me. They tend to be in charge of areas of specific expertise or areas of specific expertise. So particular schools of painting, in the case of the National Gallery, we have curators of American and British painting, French painting, Italian Renaissance, Northern Renaissance, modern, which is more than painting, it's sculpture and all kinds of things. But broken down into those broad areas of expertise. And my particular history at the Gallery, I've been in the job I'm in now as Deputy Director. I'm starting my 10th year, but for much longer before that, I was in the Department of American and British Paintings. I was a curator of that material, American and British paintings. Now, the 30 or so curators that we have at the Gallery are responsible for over 145,000 objects. And those are in distinct areas. They include paintings, sculptures, decorative arts. And by decorative arts, that's a very wide-ranging term. It can mean furniture, it can mean applied arts, it can mean silver, glass, all kinds of things. It's not a huge part of our collection, but it is part. Works on paper, which include prints and drawings, photography, photographs, modern art, which can be all kinds of media, including time-based now media, video, performance, all sorts of things. We are not as wide-ranging in those areas of our collection, say, as something like the Metropolitan Museum, which ranges from the ancient to the modern and across all world cultures. The Metropolitan Museum, I said we have about 145,000 objects. The Metropolitan likes to say they have over 2 million, although I have a friend there who tells me it's really more like 400,000 because they have some sort of secret caches. They have a huge collection of all things baseball cards. So their numbers are somewhat skewed, but nevertheless, it's a much larger. I'd love to have those cards, by the way. Can you imagine what they must have? In any event, in that general frame of curatorial work, whether it's from a small perspective of a smaller museum, a medium museum, or a very large one, there are basically 4 prime areas of responsibility. Now, these don't embrace everything curators do, and there are many things that they do, but broadly speaking, they fall into these 4 categories. Administer and supervise the permanent collection, and by permanent, that means the collection that the museum owns and it keeps. Many works of art, as you know, that you see in a museum may be there for special purposes, a temporary exhibition when they're on loan or some other reason. But the works that are in the permanent collection, the 145,000 objects that I mentioned, those are the areas that individual curators have responsibility for. And I'll look at each of these areas in some detail, some more than others. The second is conduct research on works of art. Again, primarily the works in the collections that a curator is responsible for, but it can also include others that are owned by other institutions, individuals, works that are in the area, again, of expertise of individual curators. Organize and coordinate temporary exhibitions, another huge part of curatorial work, and then acquire new works for the permanent collection. Museums are living and growing if they are not frozen in some fashion by the terms of their establishment, by a bequest or a donor's wishes. And they grow in areas where they can, often exponentially. In some areas, they don't. It's very hard to acquire Italian Renaissance paintings now. When I started my career almost 40 years ago in museum work, it was becoming harder, but not by any means impossible to acquire great works of American art, historical American art. Now it has become very difficult. So to start with the first of those areas, administer and supervise permanent collections, that includes a lot of the most, I think, probably obvious tasks you might think of. For instance, museums have galleries where permanent collections are displayed, works that can be on view on a relatively long-term basis, like paintings and sculpture, which are not subject to the disadvantages of, say, paper works, prints, drawings, photographs, which can fade over time. But the galleries are more or less the places where the permanent collection is shown. This is a view of one wall in one gallery in the suite of American galleries. This happens to be a large gallery of landscape paintings. There is always, in the museum environment, a kind of illusion of permanence in these, quote, permanent collection galleries, because they are meant to be places where you can go and have repeated experience of works of art. In this case, works by artists such as Frederick Church, Albert Bierstadt, Thomas Moran, William Stanley Hazeltine. But they're anything but that, because things happen. Works have to be taken down for whatever reason. Most often, that's because another institution is organizing an exhibition. Let's say they're organizing an exhibition on buffaloes. You might laugh, but there are art museums that do exhibitions on particular topics such as that. This is a Bierstadt of buffaloes in an extraordinary stormy landscape. They might request that work for the exhibition. It then goes to the curator for their evaluation. They look at things like what is the scholarly importance of the exhibition, various things. Does the museum or other institution meet the requirements in terms of security, environmental controls, a host of things. With conservators, an evaluation is made. Can the work of art stand the vicissitudes of travel? Can it be packed safely? Can it be sent? However, by train, rarely, by car, airplane, safely, and then shown and enjoyed in another institution and then brought back. But every time something like that happens, you can imagine that when this painting leaves, you suddenly have a gap. And it's not always the case that you have something exactly appropriate and the right size, everything, to put right into that gap. So frequently, and this can drive art handlers and others crazy, curators end up reinstalling entire galleries because of one painting going out on view. That's if you're lucky. Sometimes you actually do 2 or 3 galleries, but it's a tremendous sort of juggling and moving around of works, but still trying to maintain both a representation of the collection, but also that notion of a kind of permanence of experience. Also, I mentioned conservation. Curators are responsible with conservators for evaluating works of art in terms of their condition, both in terms of are they suitable for loan, are they suitable for display, but do they need attention in any way? And that can be in myriad ways. And that can be, they may just be as simply have a discolored varnish that would be taken off to great advantage to show the painting more clearly. They may have areas of what's called overpaint, where damage in a previous time has been touched up by previous restorers, and sometimes that can be done quite expertly, sometimes it can be done not so. Most often you find old restorations of paintings tend to do too much, where there might be a small, let's say, the size of a dime loss of paint in a sky of a landscape. It's not unusual for someone who restored that, rather than just try to paint that little spot and make it blend in, repaint an entire area of the sky. Curators evaluating that sort of thing with conservators try to make judgments about how can the work best be treated and best be shown in its optimum way for our viewers and visitors. This is a view of our paintings conservation lab, one part of it. You see a lot of things here. You see actually here's a Italian Renaissance painting lying on a table for examination. It's a panel painting, but it's actually on something that's called a cradle. That's an early way of trying to stabilize a panel, a wooden panel, to keep it from moving as humidity and temperature change. And as these paintings, particularly works that have been in, say, a chapel or one setting for hundreds of years are moved to other places, they may experience changes in these environmental issues that will make them move. Now, it was long ago thought that creating this kind of bracing mechanism, which is made up of, this is if you ever want to know everything about cradles in about 30 seconds. They're made up of cross pieces of wood that are meant to move. And they brace the panel and they move slightly when the panel moves with the changes. Unfortunately, the wooden members of the cradle, those cross pieces, also swell with humidity and change with temperature. They tend to lock into place. So they become rigid and make the problem worse. That is often something that you have to make a judgment call about whether to remove it, to redo something that was done with good intentions. Most often, the sort of starting point is do no harm. So if you can leave it alone, maintain proper environmental controls, probably it won't need that. There are all kinds of other things that we use. This is a light, but there's stereo microscopes. There are various ways of looking at paintings. This is a very large painting. I believe it's Manet's Old Musician. Can't quite tell, but you're seeing it there in either a large infrared or X-ray view. Here's another large Italian painting. This is actually part of a huge Joshua Reynolds called Lady Delmay and Her Children, which was under conservation at that time. Reynolds was a notoriously difficult artist for our future generations to deal with because he used paints that didn't always dry properly. He blended paint and varnish, did all kinds of things. Anyway, there are many challenges for this kind of care and treatment of permanent collections. And as I say, these are worked out between curators and conservators with the hope that in the end there'll be a good result. Oftentimes, we undertake conservation and learn a great deal about a work of art that we didn't know before. That can be from literally just from close examination with a microscope. I once looked at a date on a painting that for as long as could be remembered was read 1860. Absolutely, that's what it looked like. And when I was working on that particular painting, it was by an artist named Fitzhenry Lane, I began to wonder, he died in 1865, and in the last couple of years of his life, his style changed a little bit. And I began to wonder whether this painting didn't fit better with that later style. And looking at the date under a stereo microscope, we were able to discern that the final digit was, in fact, a 3, 1863, not 0. Couldn't see it otherwise. In any event, we often learn many things, and often we undertake examinations of paintings where they're not treated. They're examined so that we do understand more about them, particularly when we're getting ready to work on them for some particular purpose. Now, I mentioned that leads into research. There is a responsibility that is true for all curatorial work to understand as much as possible about the works that are in your care. In some areas, that can be enormous numbers of objects. The collections of American and British paintings are somewhere around 2,000, but that dwarfs in comparison to something like 80,000 prints, for instance. No one can be expected to know every single thing there is to know about every single print, but you can aspire to know as much as possible. There are enormous numbers of questions that can be raised by works of art, and they're very, in many cases, very, very basic ones. For instance, who painted it? That may be obvious. It may be long associated with a particular artist. This is a Thomas Cole painting. It is also signed, as this tells us right here, an inscription. But that doesn't always mean it's true. There are false signatures. Where was it painted? When was it painted? What, if anything, does it mean? Who owned it in the past? That can be very important. Where has it been exhibited, both in its own time, 1826 in the case of this painting, and in the years since? What is its condition? What are we seeing? Are we actually seeing everything here as the artist meant it, or have things changed over time that can affect how we understand it? There are also specific types of questions that can be raised by specific types of paintings. With a portrait, there's always the question of who the sitter is. And that is something that, again, may seem to be perfectly obvious. You are given a painting by a family. They said, this is great, Aunt Mirabelle. She lived 200 years ago, and she was painted by John Singleton Copley, the great Boston painter. That's wonderful. And that may well be exactly what they believe, but that can often not be true. There's a lot of invention that happens in family histories, as you probably all know, and it often takes the form of claiming ancestors who aren't necessarily your own, but nevertheless, it's part of the job of a curator to untangle that. Genealogy, the researching of family trees, history, that's one of the skills you learn if you're working on portraits. With a landscape painting like this, where is it painted? Is it a real place? Or was it something the artist imagined? With a still life painting, there's the identity of what's depicted, the fruit or the flowers or whatever, and that can lead to other questions. Again, is it a real kind of image? Did the artist actually place all those fruits or flowers together on a table and paint them? Or, as we've learned, in many cases, did they actually paint fruits from one season and flowers from another and create these wonderfully sort of creative combinations? So there are a lot of different skills that you might need to hone as a curator. And let me just briefly walk you through some of the basic ones that you need in identifying the fundamental aspects of a work of art when you're doing research. This particular page I'm showing you here is information that would be ultimately published in what's called a systematic catalog. The gallery over the last 40 years has been publishing, originally in print, we're now doing it online, catalogs of all of the objects eventually in the permanent collection, documenting them as thoroughly as possible. So this work by Thomas Cole, it starts with some very enigmatic numbers. If you don't know what that is, that's called an accession number. It simply is our record number, tells you certain things. If it's done a certain way, the work entered the collection in 1989. It was the 24th work of art to enter the collection in 1989. And in this instance, it was one object that came at that 24th moment. There could be several objects that came by gift or whatever, but basically that tells us that. It tells us the physical dimensions, the physical nature, oil on canvas. It tells us who gave it to us and why sometimes, the inscriptions, technical notes. As much as you can summarize, and curators write these technical notes in consultation, again, with conservators, as much as you can summarize what is known about the painting, what its present condition is, when it was most recently treated, discolored varnish was removed, painting restored in 1990. Provenance. Very, very important. the history of ownership of a painting. In this case, we have both good provenance and we have bad provenance, as in we have absolute clear knowledge of where the painting first began its life, who owned it, who in fact commissioned it. A man named Robert Gilmore of Baltimore, who died in 1848. We know that in 1826 he commissioned from Thomas Cole a painting that he left the subject matter up to Cole. I'll go on about that in a moment. What we don't know is, and when there is a period in a provenance line, that means stop. We don't know what happens next. If it's a semicolon, then we're telling you what happened next, we think. And you'll see what happened next. Somebody named Robert Hall in Hamden, Connecticut in 1968. When it says until 1968, that simply means we know they owned it in 1968. We have no idea when they owned it previously, how they got it, anything. So from the time of Gilmore's death in 1848 to 1968, no trace of this painting whatsoever. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells you a lot of things. Most importantly, it tells you that there's a mystery there that you ought to try to solve. And as a curator, I worked on this painting. One of the first things I did was I went to Baltimore. Robert Gilmore was a very well-known Baltimorean in the 19th century. He had major art collections. There's a lot of documentation about him. His will exists. I went to the Baltimore Register of Wills. I spent time going through his will. And unfortunately, I only found miscellaneous listings of paintings. He owned so much that there was no inventory, specifically documenting every work and where it ended up, where it was going. In fact, I even know from some correspondence between Robert Gilmore and his sister that he had paintings that he owned lent to his siblings and his relatives. They were all over the place. So that was no help. Also discovered that many of the papers that might have helped with research on Gilmore, and this is true of other Baltimore figures, were destroyed in an early 20th century fire that burned up some archives that were very important. So I don't know anything. Well, how do I know that it showed up in Hamden, Connecticut in 1968? Because a dealer in New York, Kennedy Galleries, and a parentheses means that it was owned by a dealer, but they had it for sale. They were not collectors. They were owning it in the terms of, or they were owning or representing it for an owner. They were selling it. We know that because their records tell us that they got a phone call in 1968 from somebody named Robert Hall in Hamden, Connecticut, who said, I have a painting, it says Thomas Cole, would you be interested? To which they obviously said yes, and they subsequently sold it almost immediately, semicolon, to Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller, who ultimately gave it to the National Gallery in 1989. Now, interestingly enough, in my researches into Gilmore's history, I found out there was a branch of the family named Hall. And I thought, well, that is very exciting. That might tell me something, except I could find no trace of Robert Hall from Hamden, Connecticut, period. Nothing. So I have no idea whether he was a family member, a descendant, or whether the painting could have changed hands umpteen times in those missing years. Maybe someday it'll be discovered. I don't know. But I never found out. But there's some other questions a painting like this raises. Where does it fit in an artist's general career? This is very early for Cole. This is really the second year of his professional career. He's discovered in 1825. He rises very quickly to fame. This turns out to be a crucially important painting in that process. But what do we know about it in terms of what it portrays? It's called Sunrise in the Catskills. And that's a rather generic term. The Catskills are a whole range of mountains in New York State. There's nothing here that says particularly any very recognizable mountain or series of mountains. And there's nothing in the title that gives us any clue, the way, for instance, a later painting by Cole is quite specific. The Notch of the White Mountains, parentheses, Crawford Notch. That tells us exactly where this is in the White Mountains. It's a place called Crawford Notch, and that's a place that's real. It exists. You can go there. I've gone there. This is another side benefit of being an art historian working on landscape painting is you get to go all kinds of places, sometimes dragging unwilling companions, trying to find places that you never find. But anyway, Crawford Notch is easy. But having found it and looked at it in comparison to the painting, it raises a whole host of other questions. Is this really that? This is Mount Webster. We know exactly what Mount Webster is. Here it is. He painted it this way. It's much taller. It's steeper. This is the notch. This is the famous elephant head, as it's called. You get to get very interested in all kinds of things here. That looks like an elephant's head. You can actually see it better in Cole's vantage point here, but he's made it bigger, more prominent. He's also made the notch, the pass into this mountain valley steeper and narrower. He's taken license here in his creative approach. He's obviously done things like he's put in a sawn tree stump in the foreground, a natural stump here, a little building, some dead trees, a man on horseback, a building, all kinds of things. They may or may not have been there when he sketched this place, which we know he did. Earlier, we have his pencil sketch of this actual site, and not all those details are there, nor is that stormy sky there. Probably saw it on a nice clear day. So he's done a lot of things here to not embellish in a negative sense. He's added to the picture. He's done things. Now, there are a lot of reasons that can be speculated about why he did some of these things and other things. And if you wish to punish yourself by studying all those reasons, you can read what I wrote about this painting in the systematic catalog, and where I go on great length, I assure you. But it's interesting. It's interesting to me. But we don't have that advantage with the painting I was just talking about, because Sunrise in the Catskills tells us only a general location. But we do have. Cole was aware of his own, perhaps, significance and his early career, which, as I said, was kind of jump-started in 1825. He kept a list of paintings at various times in his life, but particularly in this early moment from 1825 to about 1827, a meticulous list of paintings that he did. And another thing you must learn if you're doing this sort of research is how to read handwriting of all different kinds. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. I know Cole's handwriting very well. I can tell you that this says view from the top of the Falls of Catterskill, Hone, something, Hone, H-O-N-E. I know who that is. That's a man named Philip Hone, New York patron who commissioned a work from Thomas Cole of the Falls of the Catterskill in the Catskill Mountains. Sunrise from the Fly, capital F-L-Y, Mountain Gilmore. That's the name we know already, Robert Gilmore. This is that painting. Just to show you, this is view down the Clove, the valley. And this is sunrise and sunset, small. See how easy that is to read? Let me tell you, Cole could also write in the tiniest handwriting I've ever seen. And he did that on his drawings, where he would record things like color and details, and it's maddening to read it, or try. Okay, so in this case, we get a clue here that this is something sunrise, which we already knew from the title, from the Fly Mountain. Now, in Washington, there are all kinds of resources that we have. And in fact, what I did when I was trying to puzzle this out was I called the U.S. Geological Survey, and I said, let me have the person who's an expert on the Catskills. They put me right through to someone who was an expert on the Catskills. And I said, where is Fly Mountain? And they said, there's no Fly Mountain. I said, well, I know there must be. There's a painting that we have of Fly Mountain. He said, it's not. You don't have a painting. There's no Fly Mountain. He said, could it be Vly, V-L-Y mountain? I said, Vly mountain? He said, there is a Vly mountain. I said, where is it? He said, oh, it's in present-day Halcott Township, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, that's interesting. Where is that on a map? And he told me, and I looked at it. I also knew from letters, which fortunately survived, between Thomas Cole and Gilmore. I know lots of things. I know, for instance, this painting was delivered to Baltimore on Christmas Day, 1826, because that's in the letters. But I also know before the painting got there, Cole described it to Gilmore and said, I think you'll like it. It's very nice. It's a dramatic picture. It's from a scene in the Catskills near the headwaters of the Delaware. He meant the Delaware River, which does actually rise in the Catskill Mountains. And guess what? The headwaters, the beginning of the Delaware River is very close to Vly Mountain. So Vly is the word, and somebody at some point went in and either corrected what they thought was a mistake, or more likely, many of the names in the Catskills, indeed Catskill ultimately derives from a Dutch word. It may have been that Vlaai was in the local pronunciation something more like fly. I don't know. But they changed it thinking they were going to be helpful. But they weren't. But mystery solved. It's very satisfying to do something like this, admittedly on a level that not many people are going to find that interesting. But I do. Now, I mentioned that this sort of work is primarily directed at the permanent collection, and that's where your primary responsibilities are. But if you have expertise as a curator, and all the curators in the National Gallery of Art do have areas of expertise and great depth of knowledge, you are often called upon by the outside world to help them with questions about works of art. In my case, one of the artists I've spent a lot of time working on is named Frederick Edwin Church, actually a pupil of Thomas Cole. And I wrote my doctoral dissertation and my first book on this artist. And over the years, I have been asked many questions about Church, but most often I am asked, can this painting be a Frederick Church? Not surprisingly, the market for an artist can affect how often you'll be asked that question, because people find things, they think it looks like a Frederick Church. Someone may have thought that earlier and signed it. A Frederick Church, most often, it's not. I try to help as best I can. I try to say this may be something. In some cases, you even are sent reproductions, and you have to help explain how that is without hopefully being a little bit too devastating to the person. But sometimes there are works that turn up that are right, and these come out of the blue. Especially since the creation of the internet, they can come from anywhere. I got an email from, I think it was somewhere in Ohio 2 years ago, with a photograph of this painting, which was clearly right by Frederick Church. I had no knowledge of it whatsoever. I'd never seen a photograph of it. I'd never read a description in a contemporary reference that seemed to describe it. It was signed and dated. It looked to me, I can't show you the detail, but it looked to me like it said 1858, which fit perfectly with what I thought was its style when it was painted by this artist. I subsequently went to New York to examine the painting in person, and looking at it with a magnifying glass, found out that it was actually painted in 1853. So in fact, that turned upside down what I thought I knew about this painting. It was 5 years earlier than I thought, but that's another matter. Totally undiscovered, unpublished painting. No idea where it came from. But it's absolutely right. It's an addition to our knowledge of the body of work of Frederick Church. Also, last year, I got another inquiry about this painting, which I immediately recognized, not because I'd ever seen a photograph of it or anything, but because I knew in 1875, Frederick Church had painted something called After the Rainstorm, which was dramatic enough that several people wrote about it, about how dramatic it was. They described this lifting of a dark cloud after a storm and this big tree and all sorts of things. So I had an idea specifically what this painting must have looked like. It actually was nothing like the picture looked like. I mean, what I imagined wasn't this at all. I imagined something very different. Nevertheless, when I saw it, I knew what it was and was able to fill in one more piece of the puzzle. In fact, in 1989, when I did an exhibition on Church here at the gallery, in the introduction, I wrote about the fact that we knew a lot now about Frederick Church, some almost 90 years after his death in 1900. And I said there were only a few major paintings still unlocated. That was one of the ones I mentioned, After the Rainstorm. So now it's been discovered. So there are other ways that one's curatorial expertise can come into play and to be of use and to help. And we do try to answer such inquiries. We're not allowed here at the gallery, and this is true in most museums, to provide formal authentications. I can't write a letter that says this is a Frederick Church. You can get into trouble with that sort of thing. Nor can we provide monetary evaluations of what something is worth. We can refer owners to all kinds of sources that might help them, auction houses, dealers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, to back up a little bit, how does one get to the point of doing this sort of things I've been talking about as a curator? How do you get there? What's your background? How do you do it? Well, I used to tell my students, I taught for many years at the University of Maryland, don't follow my example. I went to college to be an English major, but what I really wanted to do was to be a rock and roll musician. And if you ask me what was my earliest memory of a job that I wanted, I would tell you I was probably about 5 years old, and I realized that my life's dream would be to do something that combined two major interests of my 5-year-old self: dinosaurs and heavy earth-moving equipment. And I realized that if I could be a paleontologist working for the American Museum of Natural History in New York, maybe I could do both. I didn't realize you need little tiny picks and whisk brooms and things like that. I thought somebody has to dig them up, so why not drive a bulldozer and be a paleontologist, sort of like Indiana Jones with a hard hat. And that's the first inkling that I had of some profession. It happened to be a museum profession. It ended up being nothing at all, obviously, like I went on to do. I ultimately changed my major to art history for reasons I won't go into. I went on to study art history at the graduate level, earned a master's degree, a doctorate. Much of my training as a graduate student, however, was in medieval architecture and sculpture. Nothing to do with American and British painting, but that's another matter. I went on to specialize in that. There are now courses that offer advanced degrees, master's, doctorates with curatorial tracks. There were, at the time I was in graduate school, actually degrees in museum studies. Those are all legitimate ways of moving towards a curatorial career. Again, I also told my students, if you target something like, I want to be a curator of American British paintings at the National Gallery of Art, you've lowered the window of opportunity significantly. There are only few such jobs out there, and you need to be aware of that. I was constantly told as a graduate student by my advisors, it's going to be hard to find a job, and don't expect to make a lot of money. Now, to give you just some proof of how true this is, we were told by our former president once, as an example, do something that will give you a living, make a living. Don't become an art historian. And here's Conan Bryant saying that President Obama apologized for saying a person with an art history degree doesn't earn a lot, and then he turned to an art history major and ordered a Frappuccino with soy. Funny. Interestingly enough, Obama got all kinds of mail from art historians who said that's just not fair, and he wrote letters, some very nice letters of apology. But there's some truth to this. And indeed, if you were to think about what does society perceive art historians, curators, art historians, what is it they do? How do they spend their time? Well, here's a nice illustration of that. What my friends think. I look at paintings all day, of course. Here's Picasso's Guernica. I'm asked that all the time. What do you do all day? Just look at paintings all day? I don't, but I would love to. What my mom thinks I do. Serious, in the library, studying all the time, What society thinks I do. Some sort of crazed individual here who's deep into the books and lost to the world, the real world. What do my professors think I do? Well, what you don't see here is the typical environment for studying art history is a darkened room with slides. And as a professor who taught for 18 years, I can assure you, this is not something you see, you hear it. All too often. You learn not to take it personally. What do I think I do? I get to unveil to the world great masterpieces like this Vermeer, the last one in private hands. What do I really do? Play video games. Well, when I was a graduate student, video games were not what they are today. They were some very rudimentary Pong and things like that. And in fact, when I was writing my dissertation and when I would go crazy with I've got to do something, I would play on my early computer Space Invaders. So maybe there's some truth to that until I became an admiral in the fleet and I could hang up my Space Invaders card for good. Anyway, it's interesting. But there's some particular aspects, and I'm talking about my experience because that's what I know best, that had a huge bearing on my ultimate decision to work in museums and become a curator. And one of them was straight out of college with an art history degree, which I had no idea what I would do with an undergraduate art history degree. I went back to my home. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and lo and behold, someone told me there was an advertisement in the newspaper, back in the classified ads in those days, that said they were looking for an Artmobile curator. I had no idea what an Artmobile curator was. But I found out quickly. The museum in Richmond, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, is a state museum. It has a role across the state, not just in its headquarters in Richmond. And it tried to fulfill that role in many ways. The most inventive, the most remarkable of those was in 1953, the museum commissioned a custom tractor trailer unit that could be used like a bookmobile to create installations, exhibitions, and then moved from town to town around the state to be visited by citizens, students, anybody who wanted to come, free of charge. And with that mobile gallery, there was a curator. There was someone who drove it. That was not me. There was someone who did everything else, and that is set it up, do things like, doesn't look like much, but these stairs are made of metal, and they have to be picked up every time, fold down that door, put those things on by yourself. I mopped the floors, I set the lighting, I packed the objects in the exhibition. Now this is about 1953, and you see this wonderful view of the original Artmobile. There were ultimately 4 Artmobiles working the circuits in Virginia. I started in January 1975, and I did it for about a year and a half, 3 complete turns on a circuit. I've been to every single county in Virginia. And I'm not saying that facetiously. I enjoyed it. I mean, I learned a lot about that. You can see that this was not an unambitious program. This is an exhibition on one of the early Artmobiles of works from the collection of Mr. and Mrs. Paul Mellon. Some of these you'll recognize. This is a Gauguin, they're here in the gallery. Gauguin self-portrait, a Degas, the famous Manet, Plum Brandy. These are masterpieces, and they were circulated in this way. Mr. Mellon and Mr. and Mrs. Mellon were patrons of the Virginia Museum. An extraordinary opportunity for people who couldn't come for whatever reason to Richmond to visit the headquarters museum. What was most influential for me was not just learning about my first exhibition that I had to take out on the road in January 1875. I once was said, you live in the 19th century, you're always talking about all this old thing. But 1975 was on Art Nouveau, French, English, Belgian, a few American things, all kinds of objects, Tiffany lamps, stained glass, silver, posters, sculpture, all kinds of things. I knew nothing whatsoever about that, and I studied for about a week in the museum library, and then it was literally hit the road and give tours, give school talks, all of that sort of thing. I also had to learn for the first time in my life literally how to handle works of art, actually pick them up and put them in a packing case and make sure they were secure and secure the packing case, get to the next place, do the opposite. Unpack it, put it on a pedestal, put it in a case, change the lighting, make sure everything was right. That was enormously influential on me because up to that point, other than the odds and ends that I had encountered in my family, they had some paintings and they had some this and that, I had never actually had the experience of a physical work of art in that way. Sitting in a classroom is very divorced from that. I have a saying, which is, you don't learn that in graduate school. I don't know that I ever saw a slide in graduate school of a painting that showed me the frame. And so when I became a curator, one of the first things I had to get up to speed on is, my God, these all have frames. And are those original? Are they appropriate? Has the frame been damaged? All sorts of questions. I certainly in school never was taught how to pack works of art or what their intrinsic, qualities were. That was very influential on me because it brought home to me the real quality of works of art, the physical nature that they exist in space and time. Also, I spent 8 hours a day sitting, either going to a school and lecturing or mainly sitting and giving tours or sometimes just sitting because there was very little traffic in the proximity of works of art. And there's a very discouraging statistic one sometimes will encounter about how much the individual visitor to a museum, how much time they may spend looking at a work of art, and maybe something like 45 seconds on average. It takes time to understand works of art. And when you are spending literally hours looking at these works of art, in addition to talking about them, you will see things that you never imagined you would see. You'll also sometimes be told things by visitors that you hadn't realized. I had a show on landscape painting. It was one of my Artmobile exhibits. I had been with that show for several months, had about 18 paintings in it, and I thought I pretty much knew everything there was about that. Went from the late Renaissance up to about the 1940s. Someone, it was a young person, came to me and said, "Do you know that there's water in every single one of these paintings?" And I said, "No, I didn't." And we went around and they pointed out to me. I mean, in one case it was a little puddle, but it was true, it was water. I hadn't seen that, Mr. Expert. So I learned a lot, but I also learned that there's a kind of magic in dealing with real objects, real works of art. Again, that was not something I was necessarily taught in school, graduate school included. You could express those interests. You could get internships in museums and that sort of thing. But at the time I was a graduate student in the 1970s, it was still not uncommon for your professors to discourage you from going into museum work because they thought you would be much better in the academic setting where you could do the highest, what they considered the highest sort of achievements of scholarly research, et cetera. That's changed a great deal in the years since, in a way that recalls my youthful desire to be a paleontologist, heavy equipment operator. I also came up with an idea that when I hit the job market, I thought it'd be perfect if I could be a curator at a university museum and teach, which never actually happened, although it happened once I became a curator here, that, as I said, I became a member of the faculty also at the University of Maryland, and I taught there for 18 years and was able to do that combination. Now, the third major area I'll touch just briefly on of the curatorial responsibilities I've been outlining is organize exhibitions. And that can be, again, a wide range of things. They can be small. An exhibition can be one painting. It can be 200 plus paintings, as in the case of the exhibition that my colleague, the late Nick Sikorsky, and I did in 1995 on Winslow Homer. There's all kinds of work involved. This was a 5-year project from 1990 to 1995 when it went up on the walls. It involved travel, 3 years of travel, visiting museums, private collectors, getting lost, doing all kinds of things. This was before MapQuest. It was fun, though. My colleague Nick and I had a little game we would play because we would often go to a town in this country where there was an art museum where perhaps neither of us had ever been. And we would put aside the directions that we'd been given, and we'd say, where's the art museum likely to be? Because the history of an art museum and the history of a town, a city, a village, whatever, may give you a clue. And in fact, older museums in established communities tend to be downtown, like the Worcester Art Museum, if you know that, in Worcester, Massachusetts, or the Museum of Fine Arts is not right downtown in Boston, but it's close. More recent ones often tend to be further out, more into the suburbs, this sort of thing. So we would guess, okay, we're coming to Dayton. Where's going to be the art museum? Let's guess. And we would guess, and we would drive around looking for it. And invariably, I don't know why, we either found a Masonic temple or we found the art museum. I used Dayton because actually the Masonic temple that we found was next door to the art museum. I don't know why. But anyway, all kinds of things would go into organizing one of these exhibitions, choosing the works, writing a catalog. They are productions that involve many, many people to see their realization. Curators are associated with them, but they're just one part of the task. And I like to liken a major lone exhibition such as Winslow Homer in 1995 is very much in a way like a movie or a grand theatrical production. You're there to enjoy it. You're not there to think about every last thing that went into making it happen. But if you're interested, when the credits roll at the end of the movie, you'll see how many people it took. Or when you look at the playbill for a theatrical production, or if you read the acknowledgments in an exhibition catalog, many, many people are involved in making these happen, not just the curators. I'm going to go now just to the end and to what is probably the most, for me personally, exciting and in some ways most challenging part of the job of a curator, and that's make acquisitions for the collection. As I mentioned, museums tend to be growing institutions. Collections can be developed, can be enriched. When I came here, first in 1980, the American painting collection was relatively small. There were, for instance, to my knowledge, only 2 still life paintings in the collection. There were a few landscapes, but a lot of portraits. Since then, the collection, through the efforts of a lot of people, not just myself, has grown to be one of the greatest in existence, if in fact not the greatest in existence. And acquisitions over the last 40 years or so have been very, very important parts of that. Acquisitions happen in many ways. Every curator can tell you stories. They'll all be different. They don't follow patterns. What I've always felt is you need to be flexible and you need to be adaptable because you never know. I used to tell my students, they said, how do you find works of art to buy or to acquire for the museum? I said, you never know what's out there. And if you're not out there looking, you'll never know. So be out there, visit dealers, read auction catalogs, look in newspapers, do whatever. Don't ignore phone calls because sometimes you'll find out about something. So let's start with maybe one of the most straightforward ways. Go shopping, go to New York, where, for instance, if you're doing American historical paintings, the real center of the market was. And in the 1980s and 90s, there were a dozen major galleries handling historical American art. Historical, I mean, pre-mid 20th century. There are very few now because the supply has dried up as more and more works were acquired and put into either museum collections or in some cases private collections. You never know what you'll see at a dealer. I walked into a place called Herschel & Adler, which still exists in New York, around 2003, I think it was. And the proprietor of Herschel & Adler immediately said, come here, I want to show you something in my office. Now that means you're not going to look at something that's in the public area of the gallery where they often have an exhibition. You're not going to the traditional viewing room where quite literally they'll often have velvet curtains and easels where they'll very dramatically unveil something for you to see. If you're going to the proprietor's office, you're probably going to see the most important thing they have right then because that's where the artist, the owner wants to have it. They want to look at it. They keep it from too many people seeing it. So I walked into his office and this painting was on the wall. And I did not at first know who the artist was, but he told me immediately that this was an Asher B. Durand painting. And when he told me that, by a good stretch of luck and good fortune, I knew exactly what it was. Because when I'd been working on Frederick Church had painted a scene of a ruined ship, a wrecked ship in 1852 that I was researching, and I was curious, who else did that subject that he might have known? Did Cole do it? Did Asher Durand do it, for instance, another major landscape painter in New York? Well, it turns out, yes, Asher Durand in 1844 painted a picture of a stranded ship that was well received. There are critical notices of it, descriptions, but as far as I knew, had disappeared completely. Again, no photograph of it, nothing like that. So I see this is good luck that I actually had done that research and knew what this painting was. And I always loved to kind of show dealers up a little bit. And they said, you ever seen anything like that? And I said, no, because Durand only painted 2 images of wrecked ships, one of which was shown in 1838, and the other one's this one in 1844, at which point, the dealers, hands over the ears, But I recognized not just what it was, but the importance of it because it's a rarity in this artist's body of work. Not the kind of thing they did very often. This, which is another painting in the gallery's collection, is more typical. And we owned several typical Durands, so it was the example of a work that didn't really correspond to what you thought of as an artist's normal creation, and we acquired it. Now, what happens in an acquisition? Well, you've got to go to a committee that's formed of your trustees or a subset of your trustees, and they evaluate certain things. What they don't evaluate is this kind of thing. Is it going to be a fridge magnet or whatever? But you do try to evaluate the relevance, the importance, the quality, all of these things, so that the decision that's made can be a sound one and one you hope doesn't prove mistaken in some way in the years to come. National Gallery does not deaccession works of art other than the rare exception of so-called duplicate prints, which is very rare. So when you buy or acquire by gift some work of art for the collection, it's here. And I think that's a very good policy. I think it's one that makes you very much aware of what you're doing. Now, luck, again, can come in various ways. I was working in another capacity, helping a museum, the Albany Institute of History and Art, prepare a catalog of their collection of Hudson River School paintings, which was rich in Cole and Church and some of the artists that I had worked on. And one of the paintings I was working on was this Thomas Cole of a ruined tower in the Albany collection. Wonderful painting, and as I worked on it, I tried to identify as many other examples by Cole of that subject, the ruined medieval tower, the remnants of some great castle. I knew he'd done it in a major painting called The Present. Here it was one of a pair of paintings. Also, this may look like a detail of that, but this is just a small sort of knockoff of this. There are probably 8, 10 major paintings that Cole did of these ruined towers in the late 1830s in particular. But what struck me was that there was one such painting that Cole wrote about extensively, and he wrote to Asher B. Durand. In fact, in New York, Cole was living in Catskill at this point, New York, where he was painting, and he talked about painting a picture that he described quite specifically. Here's part of that description. And I thought, well, can this help me identify anything? Does it correspond to the Albany painting? And clearly it does not. It talks about islands out in the ocean. It talks about the moon is ascending, which it's not. It talks about a shepherd who's seated on a fragment of the ruin, and other things like a distant vessel. None of that was in this painting. And we know that Cole finished that painting in 1838. He exhibited in New York. It apparently went to a New York collector, and then as far as we know, it vanished. No trace of it. Again, no photograph of it that I was aware of, no record. I came back in 1993 from vacation in the summer to my office in this building, and on my desk were a stack of black and white photographs of this painting on the left. And I had never seen this painting before, and I asked my assistant, where did this come from? And they said, oh, someone showed up at the loading dock in a station wagon with this painting looking for you because they knew that I had some knowledge about Thomas Cole, and they asked to see you, and you weren't here, and they said, oh, well, I wanted to show them this painting, and my assistant, fast thinking, said, let us make some photographs of it real quickly, and we'll show it to him when he gets back, which they did. And there it was, literally, out of the blue, photographs exactly corresponding, the moon ascending, the shepherd seated on the ruin. This was the painting I'd been reading about. It had literally fallen into our laps. We had several major examples by Cole, but not one of these European subjects of a ruin. It fit very well with our aspirations for developing the collection, so we acquired it. Again, you never know. I answered the phone once, late on a Friday afternoon. Friday afternoons are in the news again because of so-called news dumps and things like that, but you always used to hear Friday afternoon, don't buy a car made Friday afternoon, I was sitting at the assistant's desk at the Department of American British Paintings. I was the only one there. The phone rang. I answered it, and a very nice voice, a woman's voice, said, oh, hi, this is Mrs. So-and-so. Do you have any work by Frank Benson? And I said, yes, we do. We have a painting of a woman in a white dress. And she said, oh, well, I don't suppose you'd want another one then. And I said, well, please tell me more. And she went on to tell me that one of her relatives, an ancestor, had been in a part of the family, and they had shared a vacation destination in Maine next door to where the American Impressionist painter Frank Benson summered. And while in this place, Benson painted one of his major works called Summer, 1909. It's in the Rhode Island School of Design Art Museum. And he had used for the figures in this great work several people who were there, including the daughter of the family next door, this young woman, as one of the models. Each one of these was a specific person that he based on someone he knew there. And she said, when the painting was finished, her family and the families of two of the other young women said, wouldn't it be wonderful to have our own paintings of our daughters? So Benson painted separate canvases of each of the other two, this one, and this one. And this had descended in her family. When she told me this story, I knew what the large painting looked like, and I said, pardon me for a minute, I went and got a book and pulled it out, and I said, tell me more, and she said, she's the one with red hair, she's in the right corner, we have this little painting of her, and I no longer can take care of it, and we would love to see it in a good home. And I said immediately, this is very different than what we have. Ours that we have is an interior, it's early in his career, this is a classic Impressionist painting by this artist. We would love to see it, where do you live? And politely. And she said, I live on the eastern shore of Maryland. I said, we'll be there. So we did. We went, Nick Sikowski, my late colleague, and I went there the next Monday. And lovely, lovely person, very, very generous, gave it to the gallery. We arranged to have a copy made for her to keep. And, again, I answered the phone on a Friday afternoon. Wasn't looking for a Benson, had no particular reason to think one would land that way. I once went with a collector who asked me to take him to New York to look for, specifically, they were interested in Hudson River School landscapes, things like that great Cropsey there on the gallery's collection, and colonial portraits, American portraits, like Copley, another painting in the... That's what they were looking for, so I called the dealers that I knew, and I said, this is what I'm looking for, we're coming, here's making an appointment. So we went around, and we visited dealers, and they would have what they had to show us. One dealer that we went to, we went up into the office, again, sort of special circumstances, I suppose, and they had a seascape, and they had a portrait, but in the corner of the room, I saw this, and I was immediately struck by it. I knew what it was. It was a painting by an artist named Joseph Decker, a still life painter, late 19th century American. He did various subjects, but the greatest works, I thought, and many others thought, were these extraordinary images, still life of growing, of actual, in this case, pears hanging on a tree branch, seen from below, and this wonderful notion that the pears are just getting to the point of ripeness and even overripe here. They're being eaten by yellow jackets. I was mesmerized by this, and I actually said, I'm sorry, would you please excuse me? Stop looking at what you're showing me. May I go look at that painting? Which we did, and I was even more fascinated by it when I saw it. Extraordinary things like the artist using his fingerprints to push the wet paint to make the wrinkled texture of the just major, wonderful thing. And I'd never seen it before. I knew nothing about it. I said, where did you get this? And they said, somebody called us from California. They'd done an internet search on Decker. Our name showed up because we did a show on Decker about 10 years ago. They called us and said, I found this at a garage sale in California. Would you be interested? And they were. And the gallery, the dealer, acquired it. I was struck by this, and the person I was with, who was looking for Hudson River School paintings and colonial portraits, was also struck. But I knew that we already at the National Gallery had two superb works by Decker, Green Plums and Hanging Grapes. I actually also knew that there was a third painting promised to us, which would eventually come to the gallery. And I thought, this can't be a priority. We don't really, quote, need this. The next Monday, the collector, by the way, was also struck by this painting, and although it was not at all what they were looking for, they said, let me go home and talk to my wife. We'll think about it. Maybe it's something we can buy. It's not what we're looking for. The next Monday, I came into work. I parked my car, and our director, Rusty Powell, was parking his car, and we walked in together, and Rusty said, how was your trip to New York? Did you see anything? And I said, I saw this extraordinary painting by Joseph Decker. And I described it, and I said, of course, we've already got really good Deckers. And this was also the week that our Board of Trustees was meeting. So any acquisition proposal was already way overdue. This should have been on the agenda, should have been put forward. And to his great credit, Rusty said, if it's that good, get it here. So we did. We got the painting here. I called the collector, and I said, we're really interested in this painting. Are you thinking of proceeding with buying it? With the hope that if he did, that he would ultimately give it to us. And he said, no, we've decided we can't, but since you're interested in it, we'll help you buy it. So like that, again, a painting I wasn't looking for, not even the type of painting I was looking for, came into the collection, and it was, again, when I say you never know, you truly never know. I'll just finish with one other example, which is the longest chase of a work of art in my particular career, which began in 1983, when this painting by Charles Sheeler which is one of 4 that the artist did of the great River Rouge plant, the Ford plant south of Detroit. It was part of a commission of photography that Sheeler was hired to do in 1927. He was a commercial photographer before he was famous as a painter. He went, he took pictures of the Rouge plant, and then several years later, he created 4 extraordinary paintings that are considered key breakthrough works in his career and indeed in the history of early 20th century American art. Of those 4, 3 were in museums: the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum, and the Worcester Art Museum. The 4th was in a sort of museum. It was in the Edsel and Eleanor Ford home, a house museum in Detroit. This was the only painting, classic landscape, that had been acquired by the Ford family, and it descended in the family and been given to that historic house. So one didn't necessarily think it would ever be available, but in fact, it was sold in 1983 at auction at Sotheby's for what was then a record price for an American painting, $1.5 million, 1983, very high price. I went to work in the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. That was June of 1983. I went there in August of 1983, and I immediately went to my director, a wonderful man named Sam Sachs, and I said, I'm here, and I've got a great idea for an acquisition. There's this fantastic painting. It was sold at auction. I think they want $2.5 million for it. And he looked at me like, you're crazy. He said, I understand. This is a great painting, but we do not have that kind of resource. So I thought, well, let's see what happens. Part of my job, immediately upon arriving in Minneapolis, was to coordinate and install a big traveling exhibition on American abstract painting from 1927 to 1944, organized by another museum, organized by John Lane and Susan Larson, 2 wonderful colleagues in American art. It was coming to Minneapolis, a traveling show, and I was to install it, be the coordinating curator, give tours, all that sort of thing. And in studying the catalog, here's the cover of the catalog, I was fascinated by a number of the paintings in it. Some of these were not by well-known artists. An artist I only knew the name of, Jean Zéron, a Frenchman who came to America in the pre-war period. And this example was in the show, this extraordinary sort of Mondrian, not Mondrian, abstract painting. I was intrigued by it and a lot of other works in the show as I was studying to prepare myself for the installation to come. In Minneapolis at that time, the special exhibitions were held in a kind of generic modern wing, which butted right up against this beautiful neoclassical, McKim Mead and White neoclassical building, the original part of the building. And that place where you went from the one to the other was this extraordinarily ugly doorway. It was a big door with 2 side doors with pneumatic hinges, and then just a big square thing, or sort of rectangle in the middle. It was really ugly. And all they would do was put a sign up that said, abstract painting in America, whatever. And I, some fever dream, decided, well, let's do something interesting. And I decided we should take inspiration from a painting in the exhibition. In this case, it was the Jean Zéron. And we should paint that doorway so that it evokes the spirit of the exhibition. It doesn't recreate the painting specifically, but evokes it. So I worked with one of our art handlers in Minneapolis. We came up with this, which I was I have to say, quite pleased with. It was very striking. Not long afterwards, the exhibition had opened. I got a call from someone I knew, and they said, do you know the name Barney Ebsworth? And I said, no. And they said, he owns the painting in that exhibition by Jean Zéron that you, I can't remember the word they used. It wasn't a bad word, but anyway, borrowed to create this odd thing in Minneapolis to introduce. I said, oh, God. And it never occurred to me that I would need to get permission to, quote, reproduce. It wasn't a reproduction. And I thought, oh, well, gee. And he said, well, you should know Barney Ebsworth because he's one of the major collectors of 20th century American art. And you're probably thinking, classic landscape, that Sheeler was probably in this exhibition, 1927, it's the exact period it was painted in 31, but it wasn't. But he told me Barney Ebsworth is the guy who's now bought classic landscape. And he said, he's fascinated. Someone sent him a picture of that doorway, and he said, who came up with this weird idea? And he said, I think I know who it was. It was our mutual acquaintance. And he said, he'd love to meet you sometime if you're ever in St. Louis. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. This is the man who owns, he's not mad at me. He owns Sheeler's classic landscape. So I called a friend of mine who was teaching art history at Washington University in St. Louis. And I said, how would you like me to come down there and give a lecture on Frederick Church? And she said, I'm not making any of this up, I promise you. And I said, for free. And she said, sure, great. And I said, one condition. Do you know somebody named Barney Ebsworth? She said, well, I know who he is. Everybody knows who he is. He's a major collector. I said, I would love to meet him. She said, well, I don't know what I can do, but I know someone, the chairman of the department knows him. He's been very friendly to the university, ... Maybe he'll come to your lecture. Well, maybe became, yes, he did come to my lecture. And I met him, and he said, I thought that was quite interesting what you did with my painting, and would you like to see the rest of the collection? This was in 1985 now, I think it was. And I said, I'd love to. We went to his office where he had some works. We went to his home where he had others. This painting was actually at the St. Louis Art Museum. We went there also because he had already made this part of a foundation, which meant it had a separate role. He couldn't hang it in his house. It was had various kinds of tax implications, et cetera. But it meant the likelihood was very strong that he might one day give it away, give it to an art museum. I was still working in Minneapolis at this point, and I don't think I would have had the nerve to say something like, would you ever give the painting to Minneapolis? Or, and in fact, people told me that he was so devoted to his hometown of St. Louis, born and raised there, that most likely his collection would go to the St. Louis Art Museum. Well, fast forward many years to the late 1990s. I've kept in touch with this man all these years, followed what he's been doing as a collector, and we decided to do an exhibition at the National Gallery of his collection. And when exhibitions of that type are done of private collections, it can be a very tangled path because you don't want to do something that can be perceived as enhancing the value of privately owned property. And most often the accommodations that are made are some sort of benefit to the institution, particularly the gift of works of art that will enrich the collection. And the work that I personally was most interested in this particular collection was Sheeler's classic landscape. So our director asked if this could be part of a gift to the National Gallery in the year 2000 on the occasion of the exhibition of the Ebsworth collection, and that happened in 2000. So in 1983, I first learned of this painting's availability. In the year 2000, it happened. It is true. It ain't over till it's over, as Yogi Berra said. But as I hope maybe I've given you some glimpse of, there's a lot that goes into curatorial work. There's a lot, it's fun, it's interesting, a lot of skills you learn. And so next time you have trouble, keep calm and let the art history major handle it. Thank you very much. Thank you.